This is Garage. Please, sit there. Alright, that will be fine. You may experience severe dizziness at first, but please, bear with it. Your name? Yes, Mr. Yang. Well, Mr. Yang, are you ready? Are you worried? You'll be just fine. Trust Garage. You should be able to get what you desire. Sneakers. My sneakers. Sneakers? The 90s was such an interesting time for video games. 3D graphics were starting to become the norm, home consoles like the PlayStation and the N64 became household staples, and so many new genres were born in an era when gaming was advancing at a rapid pace. It was also, at least in my opinion, when gaming was at its most experimental and creative. Every company was trying to do something fresh and new with the ever-evolving technology they were working with, and developers were far more willing to take artistic risks because of that. I mean, think about it. Most of the time when people cover weird or offbeat games, they tend to be old PC games or an obscure PS1 game you've never heard of. Not at all to say that creativity is dead now or anything, far from it, but AAA gaming nowadays definitely doesn't have the artistic whiplash of going from, say, Vibrabin's monochrome minimalism to Metal Gear Solid's cinematic realism, the cutesy, vibrant colours of Klonoa to the gothic, dark aesthetic of Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare. If we're talking weird and offbeat though, one of the first examples that comes to mind for me has got to be Oddworld: Abe's Odyssey. This guy scared the hell out of me as a kid, but I think that even at a young age, there was something enchanting about how unusual it was. The industrial dystopian world that he lived in was one that has stuck with me for years. It's grimy, gloomy, and maybe even off-putting to some people, but the fact it's so unconventional is exactly what makes it beautiful to me. It definitely kickstarted a love for the absurd in video games for me. It's an aesthetic I've been chasing after ever since, trying to find other eccentric, bizarre gems, the weirdos of the gaming world. And that is how, many years ago, I learned about Garage. Garage was written and designed by the Japanese surrealist artist Tomomi Sakuba, who teamed up with Kinotrope to develop the game, eventually releasing it on Windows and Macintosh in March 1999. Sadly, thanks to development reasons beyond its control, only 3,000 copies of Garage were ever produced. Combined with the fact it only ever released in Japan to begin with, Garage effectively became lost media the second it released. Only the privileged few who managed to snag a copy back in '99 were able to play it at all. Over the years, fans have attempted to track down an authentic copy in an effort to preserve it, but even so, there was still the Japanese language barrier to worry about. That is, until the creator Sakuba, seeing the lengths people were going to play his game, officially re-released it digitally and in English in 2021, saving Garage from obscurity and the only reason I'm even able to talk about it today. Just like that, it was widely available to the world across multiple platforms and didn't cost an arm and a leg to buy anymore. I'd kept clear of spoilers for years, waiting for this exact day to come, so obviously I raced to Steam to buy it day one. For the most part though, I was expecting Garage to just be a wacky, weird-looking 90s game. A casual jaunt into a town full of these funky little fellas and nothing more, but how wrong was I? It's a thought-provoking piece of art, and one that, the more I researched, was a deeply personal project for Sakuba. One that weaves his life experiences into its strange but captivating universe. The story behind the fandom's preservation efforts the past few decades is equally as interesting, and I will talk more in depth about that later on as well. But first, let's dive into the weird and wonderful world of Garage, a world that was saved from becoming lost media. As you saw just a moment ago, a doctor is helping a man called Mr. Yang use a machine simply called Garage. What this, frankly, terrifying looking machine actually does, we don't know yet, but apparently it'll help Mr. Yang get what he desires. And what he desires are his sneakers, naturally. We're then thrown straight into gameplay, getting the first glimpse of us, this gorgeous little baby machine looking thing. Dotted around the mirror are little memos and notes that give us small tidbits of exposition. The first one written by someone called Shen, telling us they found us unconscious floating in the sewage water beneath their house, ending the letter with some very ominous instructions. If possible, get out of this indecent world. This world is not right. Find your shadow. Everything will start from there. With this vague goal in mind, we leave our home and step out into the world of Garage. This game is a point-and-click adventure. You move around as this little guy as you explore the world looking for clues and notes that'll help you on the search for your shadow. As you might have noticed by now, you can't freely roam around. Rather, you're restricted to these tracks along the floor and you just click in the direction you want to go. We are a little biomechanical creature after all. Our head may be somewhat humanoid, sure, but our body looks more like a machine, rattling along the tracks and honestly looking like it's on the verge of falling apart. It makes sense then that our motion is limited, but equally from a gameplay perspective, it makes navigation very streamlined and straightforward. You only ever need to go up, right, left or down, and it definitely eliminates the sometimes mind-numbing exploration that other 90s point-and-click games often suffered with. Look, I love a good point-and-click, don't get me wrong, but I can't say I ever got accustomed to their moon logic. I will openly admit that many a puzzle has stumped me in these kinds of games, and it's very easy for that feeling of directionlessness to turn into frustration. Garage, however, alleviates many of these issues. For example, any interactable items on screen are usually highlighted, meaning it's borderline impossible to miss any essential items or pickups as you explore. As far as I'm aware, this is one of the many quality of life changes that were made to the game in this modern re-release. In the original version, items weren't highlighted at all, and with the very busy visual design of Garage's world, I can imagine this led to moments of frustration for players back in the day. The only thing that might get a bit confusing is just navigating the town itself. As you can see, the town is built around these two square-shaped tracks, and more or less every major building is accessible on either the inner track or the outer track. But truth be told, even after hours of playing, I don't think I was ever fully confident exactly which building was on which track. There was a lot of moments in my playthrough where I'd roll along into a building, realise it's not the one I wanted to be in, and roll back out with my tail between my legs. Especially the Madia department store, I always had to double check if I was going the right way whenever I came here. In fairness though, it's really not as bad as it sounds. This map might look like a mess of black lines, but trust me, even if you never get accustomed to the layout, you can always pull up the map to make sure you're going the right way, or worst comes to worst, just keep moving in a straight line and you will eventually come across the right location. You're just moving in a circle, or a square after all, so you can't exactly get lost. It's just self-contained enough that it doesn't become a problem. Plus, I feel the design kind of fits in a world like this. The world is run down, haphazard and unkept, so the town's own design and architecture are equally as disorganized. If you're ever confused on where to go though, thankfully the townspeople nudge you in the right direction if you speak to them. There's plenty of other biomachines scattered around town that... Whew, some of these guys have a serious glare on them, it takes a while to get used to. Once you do though, the townsfolk can offer some really valuable insight on where to go next, so you can never really get too lost. It's important to note as well that the official Garage Discord has an entire walkthrough available in English, as well as other really helpful resources and guides. Since this game doesn't have a whole ton of English language material to begin with, I definitely recommend hopping in there if you ever hit a dead end while playing. I really like the designs of these creatures though. Granted, when I first started playing the game, they creeped me out a lot, but after a few hours passed and I'd settled into the vibe and aesthetic of Garage, I ended up finding them pretty cute. They're odd looking, yes, but there's nothing threatening about them per se. Much like Abe from Oddworld, they fall into a category I like to call ugly cute, where you're initially weirded out by them, but once you see them move around, talk, and see their quirks and mannerisms, you start to warm to them a lot more. They just go about their day like anyone else, working a day job, making small talk, gossiping about other biomachines around the town. All of them have different personalities and specific interests as well. This one guy, Takashi, for example, will eagerly teach you how to fish if you speak to him, ending his explanation with, "I'm glad to have another fishing buddy." Aww. Some characters even work on a daily schedule. You might go to the department store only to find the shop owner is on a break, so you have to wait a short while for them to return for another shift. Or you might visit them in their apartment only to find they're not home. Takashi, the machine I just mentioned, is constantly moving around the different fishing spots in the town, so sometimes you may have a fishing buddy with you, and other days you won't. The game also operates on a calendar of sorts. This thing up here tells you how many laps you've done, which is basically how many days have passed. This counter doesn't impact the gameplay in any way, mind you, it's really just there to emphasize the passage of time while you search for your shadow. It really makes the world feel like it's alive though, like we're peering into a living and breathing ecosystem of these alien creatures, and yet as otherworldly as they may look, they really don't operate that differently to us humans. While most of the machines live within the town centre, there's a number of them live quite a distance away, Guattari being the prime example, having moved away from the other machines to live a peaceful life with his female companion Yoko. There's also Lau, who kind of fits into the mad scientist role in Garage, and these characters are seen as outcasts or strange by the other machines. This includes you too, unfortunately, as the others will often call you weird and different if you ask too many questions, as if they want you to fall in line and abide by an abstract social code that you're unaware of. Together with the battered, pokey design of the town itself, it all presents a very unwelcoming, almost uncomfortable atmosphere as you explore. Sometimes it feels like you're wandering into areas that you really shouldn't be, especially in the apartment blocks where there's long hallways that are so dark you can't even see the other end. The creator Sakuba has discussed his inspirations for the town's rather unique architecture in a 2005 issue of Talking Heads, a Japanese alternative art magazine. This is also the only time Sakuba has ever taken part in an interview about Garage since its 1999 release, and I was very lucky to find a physical copy of it after scouring Japanese Google. It shows a bunch of concept art and sketches from development, particularly Sakuba's vision for the town's design. He was always fond of riverside houses or areas with rivers running through them, as it reminds him of his hometown. As a child, he often explored abandoned buildings and factories, and loved that there were so many small nooks and crannies to crawl through. You can definitely see how this kind of architecture trickled its way into Garage, between the crumbling houses and endless rivers of sewage underneath your home. While you explore the world of Garage though, you need to keep a close eye on both your ego and fuel meter. Your ego meter, as the game describes, is the power that lets you be you, our sense of self, I suppose. When your ego starts to get dangerously low, you become afflicted with the so-called word lost status. Nobody can understand what you're saying, and you're unable to communicate with shopkeepers, neighbours, and other workers around town. As a result, this complete loss of speech means you can't buy or sell things, or progress the main story whatsoever. And if your ego hits zero, you completely shut down, presumably falling into some kind of catatonic state, and then you die. Whew, pretty heavy stuff. Fuel, on the other hand, is a lot simpler to wrap your head around. Fuel is what allows you to physically move around the world. Much like humans need food to survive, the creatures of this world need milky fuel. Yes, that's the actual name of it. If they run out of fuel, then they can't physically move anymore and just die. Thankfully, filling up your ego and fuel meters is pretty straightforward. There are ego clinics and milky fuel stations that will recover them instantly for a small fee, only about 20 stamps or so each. There are more options too. You can buy on-the-go refuel supplies, I always made sure to have a couple in my inventory for safety's sake, or if you dish out a good bit of money, you can permanently upgrade your tank capacity, letting you go longer without having to refuel. Now, while micromanaging these stats might sound a little stressful, thankfully both your ego and fuel only decrease when you physically move on the map. It's not like you're racing against the clock or anything for the entire game. When you stay still, both your ego and fuel stay still as well, so you can take a moment to look at your map, read notes, or check your inventory without any need to rush. I am so glad they designed it like this and didn't make the ego and fuel meters constantly ticking death timers, because that definitely would have turned Garage into a needlessly stressful experience. But refueling does require stamps, the form of currency in the world of Garage. So how do you get these stamps? Milky fuel is created by the female biomachines, but they need a pretty constant supply of fish, crabs, frogs, and other aquatic animals to produce it. Or aquatic machines, as the game calls them. Because of that, the shopkeepers will pay a pretty penny for us to bring them these animals, and so fishing, believe it or not, is a pretty core mechanic in Garage as a result. There are other means of making money. You can sell posters and other random gadgets around the place, but fishing definitely reaps the best rewards. Certain species of animals can sell for 2,000 stamps apiece, setting you up very comfortably for future refuels. And I know, mini-games like this can sometimes be hit or miss for some people, I understand, but Garage manages to strike the balance of simple, easy-to-understand mechanics while also being pretty relaxing. It's quite straightforward. Once you cast the fishing rod and get a bite, you just have to keep within the red lines here until the animal's stamina depletes. Then you just reel it in, that's all there really is to it. You don't even really have to worry about your supplies dwindling that much either. Usually when you reel in an animal, you'll find hooks and bait in their stomach that you can then reuse. So you fall into this sort of never-ending, self-sufficient fishing cycle if you want to, without any interruptions to go buy more supplies. About halfway into the game, I needed to catch 20 of a very common fish species, and I found myself continuing to fish for another hour after I already reached that number. Just because I found the simple, repetitive nature of the minigame quite relaxing and therapeutic. I just threw on a YouTube video and the time flew. Before I knew it, I'd almost doubled the amount of fish I needed in the first place. Which fish you can catch also depends on the type of hook and bait you're using, or even where you're fishing to begin with. It's an unexpectedly intricate little system because there's a lot of variables at play and a lot of fish to catch. There's literally dozens of animals to find in this game. There's fish, there's frogs, there's crabs, there's a strange penis creature that I'm going to pixelate because getting demonetized for that would be super embarrassing. And I could definitely imagine completionists sinking a lot of time into collecting all of them. There's nothing stopping you from completely halting the main story to do this either, and so in that case, I would argue that Garage is both a point-and-click adventure as well as a life simulator, a blend that you don't see very often, with some Japanese critics even drawing comparisons to games like Animal Crossing. While a quirky little fishing game does sound very cute and all though, it can't be understated that Garage still maintains a very oppressive, bleak atmosphere through it all. Not only because of its gloomy visual design that you've been seeing, but also its very unconventional soundtrack. Genre-wise, it's a blend of industrial, dark ambience and sometimes just noise, often with lots of droning, distorted sound effects thrown into the mix. It's not often you come across a game with such an experimental soundtrack, and this kind of music is obviously not for everyone, but in Garage's case it complements the dark, murky world so perfectly, I couldn't really imagine any other style of music working as well. The soundtrack was entirely composed by Tomomi Tanaka, who was friends with Sakuba since the early 90s, having met at an art gallery in Tokyo. Since not much is known about the game's development, and I really wanted to know more about the creative process behind this music, I reached out to Tanaka and he very kindly shed some light on crafting the bizarre and enchanting soundscape of Garage. He said he wanted to create music that had a feeling of, in his words, flesh and machine mixed together, and avoided sounds that were too decorated or complex because he felt it didn't fit the world. I was amazed to learn that no sampling was used whatsoever, something that's quite unusual for music of this style, and all of the audio was actually recorded by Tanaka himself. When I asked him what kind of equipment he used, he said, in the early 90s there was only a Power Mac and Windows was only decent, so I couldn't produce music on a computer, and I composed everything with an Akai sampler and something like an MPC. So the only equipment I had was an organ, a sampler, a rhythm machine, and a microphone. There was also some sounds that Sakuba and I recorded by playing with water and hitting cups and metal nearby. Other than that, I just recorded sounds on my own and made a collage. Speaking with someone who actually worked on this game was so insightful, and if you'd like to learn more about how the fascinating soundtrack of Garage was made, I've a link to the full interview down in the video description for you to check out. And of course, thank you to Tomomi Tanaka for taking the time to answer my questions. It's always refreshing to see any game push its artistic boundaries and not be afraid of being weird, something Garage achieves incredibly well, that's a compliment by the way, and the soundtrack plays a big part in this. One of the most memorable examples of this to me is when you load your save. The game always opens on a shot of you staring at yourself in the mirror, while the music slowly winds up and kicks into gear. The blank, expressionless stare in a grimy, dirty mirror, barely illuminated by one singular light in the corner, coupled with music sounding like it's literally winding up, this all captures a very specific feeling to me. The feeling of, here you are again, just another day doing the same monotonous tasks in the same monotonous town. The feeling of just going through the motions again and again. There's a certain loneliness to it. That's a pretty spot-on way of describing the world of Garage. While there are some brief moments of kindness from strangers around the town, generally speaking, most of the other characters couldn't care less about you. Most of them will only help you if you help them in return. If your ego is low and you have the word lost status, for example, they'll usually just impatiently tell you to go away. An interaction with Koppel sums up the machine's cold nature quite well. What I do is none of your business. What you do is none of my business. There's not much kindness in this world, and we see this especially in the memos and notes scattered around the place. Who's writing them and who they're directed at we don't really know, but the writer seems to be a deeply unhappy person, struggling with their sense of self-worth, constantly at odds with their own mind, and even questioning if they want to keep living at all. The further you progress, the more and more of these notes you'll find, documenting the writer's personal struggle. This is arguably the closest we have to a narrative thread throughout the game, but surely all of this has to be building up to something, right? What is this world and why does it exist? Well, it's probably time we talk about the story in Garage. Get ready, because there's a lot to unpack with this one. So, remember how at the very beginning of the game, there's a scene where someone is speaking to a Mr. Yang, and he tells Mr. Yang that with the help of Garage, he will surely get what he desires. And what he desires are apparently his sneakers. Okay, remember that, that'll all be coming up again soon. Garage is pretty light on plot for the majority of its playtime. There are 10 chapters in total, 11 if you go for what is arguably the true ending, and the first 6 of those chapters are mostly spent exploring the world looking for your shadow. Eventually coming across a lighthouse, you meet a girl called Psyche. We learn that she is someone else's shadow. Whose exactly we don't know, but she is able to point us in the right direction in finding ours. Our shadow is in a sewage canal underneath her home. Interestingly, that is the exact same place where we were found at the beginning of the game. Problem is, we have no way of safely traversing the canals. We meet Lou, who, despite her timid nature, is eager to help us on our journey, and after navigating the labyrinthine tunnels underneath her house, we finally find her shadow, a sickly-looking human creature sitting amongst the rubble. When we speak to it, it simply says, "Please don't erase me. Yang, please don't erase me." Who are you? You're not Yang. You didn't come to erase me? You are me? I don't understand. I really don't understand. But if it's true, sneakers. Find my sneakers. I don't know what it is, but I can't be me if I don't have it. This is when the story starts to truly kick in. While I'd been mostly just enjoying the ride up until this point, it was this interaction with my shadow that made me sit up a bit and pay closer attention. I was starting to speculate on what this shadow could be, why it was the only human creature in a world of biomachines, and I was starting to see the faintest narrative begin to form. Meeting with Guattari, he tells us that the sneakers our shadow wants is our core memory. Finding it will help our shadow, and therefore us, regain our memories of the past. So we do that, we find the sneakers, and yeah, in case you were wondering, it is a literal pair of sneakers, and bringing them to our shadow, it suddenly transforms into a brighter, more healthy looking version of itself before disappearing. The tone shifts ever so slightly once you've done this. Finding your shadow was your primary objective for the entire game up until this point, and now that it's been found, there's a distinct feeling that this is the beginning of the end. This is also explicitly stated by some characters. The machine Chio directly asks you if you are quote-unquote looking for your end, and nudges you in the right direction should you say yes. In this last stretch of the game we meet Shen, the machine who saved us from the sewage canal at the beginning, and the closest we have to a villain in the story. He says that you are his alter ego, and he is yours. In other words, you are both two sides of the same coin, and only one of you can continue to exist in this world. This is practically the only confrontation in the entire game, where you have to use an item called a noise score that makes both your and Shen's ego fall dramatically. On-the-go refuel comes in clutch at this part. If you're able to withstand the noise score, Shen will fall and die. Beyond him lies Juice, an almost monstrous female machine that creates milky fuel for the entire town and seemingly exists only for that purpose. She accuses you, saying her painful existence is all your fault, but the final chapter is spent caring for her, talking to her and showing her a kindness that no one has until now, until eventually she wants us to find her core memory. Much like our own sneakers, Juice wants to better understand her past, and her core memory will help her do just that. And so we find it, a small doll called Bonchan, once again in the sewage beneath her house. Returning this to Juice, we finally get the clarity we've been waiting for. Much like Shen was our other half, so too does Juice have another half, and we learn that it is Lu, the quiet machine we've interacted with only a handful of times before now. She speaks very plainly about who she is, and what her relationship is with us. In short, Yang and Lu have known each other since they were both young. As adults they were in a relationship, but it was a very toxic one. It seems that Lu had a very troubled life, and all she had ever known was loneliness and being hurt by others. Yang, us, was the first person to show her true kindness, something that she was not used to. This led to a breakdown in the relationship, and Yang eventually began to hurt her too, because Lu wasn't comfortable with it any other way. One day, however, Lu died. Whether this was at Yang's hand or external circumstances we don't know, but riddled with grief and regret, Yang spiraled into a deep depression, and seeking a way to finally work through his complex emotions, resorted to an experimental therapy method, a machine called Garage, which constructed an entire world all based on Yang's psyche. The world of Garage, the machines, their experiences, everything we have interacted with up until now was a construction of Yang's mind. A maze for us in the form of a shambling biomechanical creature to wander through and unravel our past. A way to come to terms with her trauma. And now that we are face to face with Lu, we have finally done that. She tells us of a fond memory she had with us in the real world, where you were alone in a grassy field and you both came up with your own melodies that you'd whistle while spending time together there. Finally, she tells us that she was glad to have met us and leaves us with a key. This allows us to open a floodgate, the only exit out of town, and at the end of a long track we meet our shadow one final time. He stretches out his hand towards us as we finally exit Garage. The game ends on a shot of that grassy field, the one Lu remembered so fondly. In the background we hear her whistle, Yang now finally at peace with both Lu's death and himself. If you're a little bit confused after all that, don't worry, I was too. Garage goes at a pretty leisurely pace plot-wise before it suddenly goes a mile a minute, and it's a lot to digest once the credits roll. That being said, I wanted to give you the basic rundown of the plot before I get into the real nitty-gritty of it, so let's dissect what we've been given here. Garage, like I said, is a kind of experimental therapy machine, which constructs a fake world based on your mind. Your thoughts, observations, personal beliefs all play a part in manifesting this world. It's basically a super fancy VR headset, really. Garage seems to be an advanced form of therapy for people working through trauma, or at least it is in Yang's case. He's struggling to cope with the death of Lu, someone who is very important to him, and so Garage serves as a way for him to work through that emotional baggage. And as far-fetched as this all is, I could honestly see something like Garage serving a purpose in real life. You might be less willing to talk things out with a therapist, but what if there was a way that you could work through your trauma and emotions on your own? No therapist, no real third-party intervention of any kind, nothing. Just you, thrown into a world that was created by you, and your troubled thoughts will hopefully unravel themselves along the way. And why the name Garage, exactly? I like the reviewer Sanae Tsuki's interpretation. Imagination and innovation are born not in a clean room, but in a chaotic garage. And so Garage is a fitting name for a machine that crafts an entire world based on one's imagination. Knowing now what the machine does, it made me reevaluate a lot of things in the game, the music especially. In my interview with Tanaka, I asked him what kind of mood he was going for with Garage's music, to which he replied, a slightly human or out-of-touch feeling, machines that seem to break, sounds and melodies that seem like they've been heard before but never heard before. That last part in particular really resonated with me, because I felt that exact way about much of the soundtrack as I was playing. Like I've heard it before, even though it was only my first playthrough. The sounds and audio used have a certain nostalgia to them, familiar noises you might have heard growing up. Every time I'd come to the Madia department store, for example, I always felt like the music sounded like an ad or television jingle followed by the channel changing. Or this one always sounded like a carnival or fun fair to me, albeit distorted and a little fuzzy. Considering Garage uses the memories of the user to create its world, then the soundtrack having a certain familiarity or nostalgia was likely intentional. These are sounds that Yang, or even us, the player, may have heard growing up, like a TV left on in the sitting room or a fun fair you went to with your family. Distant memories warped into a more twisted soundscape for this strange new world Yang has found himself in. Assuming this all is indeed a projection of Yang's mind then, there's a few interesting things we can take from this. For one, the most glaringly obvious, the world he created is pretty damn bleak. The buildings all look run down and dirty, and all the roads out of the town are blocked off by heavy machinery. The other machines are fairly standoffish, and I mean, even the fact they're machines in the first place is quite telling on its own, isn't it? Instead of human beings or something more familiar, Yang's mind projected everyone as these off-putting, alien-like creatures, and it really says a lot about how Yang sees the other people in his life. He clearly has a very dismal outlook on the world as a whole, and we see that not only in the machine's design, but also in their behaviour. Very quick to push you away, always saying they're busy or they don't have time for you, calling you weird or strange when you speak to them. Perhaps these are just some of Yang's own self-deprecating thoughts, or maybe when he's tried to reach out to people in the past, this was their response. I think it's also safe to say that Yang doesn't see himself very highly either. The depressing notes you can find scattered around town feel like Yang's internal monologue. Unlike the world around him and the abstract metaphors it stands for though, these memos are very blunt in comparison. Brutally honest ramblings of a very troubled mind, often degrading himself and complaining about how agonizing it is just to live. Naturally enough, some of them tend to get pretty dark, with multiple notes suggesting Yang wants to take his own life. One states, "I am rushing myself. I am cornering myself. My body is swelling up, but I am withering," with another note showing Yang's conflicting emotions about whether he wants to continue living at all. There are two me. Which me is the me now? One of me guides me, the other me kills me. There's something very haunting about the fact that throughout the game you just naturally assume these are written by someone else, but no, they're the personal writings of you, the player, and if anything, are a cry for help. Yang writing that there are two of him, one that wants to help him and one that wants to hinder him, directly plays into the existence of Yang and Shen, the alter egos. They are Yang's conflicting thoughts, personified as different machines, two facets of your personality, warring with itself. You, the player, are marching forward and willing to face your trauma head-on. Shen, on the other hand, actively tries to stop you from doing so. Shen is the resentful, hateful, self-loathing part of you that doesn't want to find peace, or perhaps doesn't have the strength to. Shen's existence then is yet another hurdle that Yang has to overcome to face reality. That does bring to question why Shen saved you from dying in the sewage at the beginning then. Why not just leave you there to die? As much as he might wish for your downfall, it sounds like a small part of him knows that facing your troubled past is inevitable. A part of him might want that too, actually. Chiyo implies this when she says, "You're not thinking about looking for your end, are you?" It's something Shen looked for but couldn't find. After using the noise score and Shen falls, he leaves behind an emotional letter, acknowledging that in order for Yang to find true peace, Shen had to die. Why you? Why not me? But the devastating truth is there is no possibility left in me. I am just an empty shell. There is no violence left in me. And that was not all. I am a hindrance to you. You won't be able to accomplish what you're capable of as long as I exist. I am putting a lid on the possibility this world has. I am the unwanted and obstructive lid itself. I should not stay in this world any longer. Please forgive me for testing you. If you're reading this, all the possibilities are in your hands right now. And no matter what action you choose, it will be the best choice. I believe so. This world is your world. Much like Yang, Lu has alter egos as well, but this is where things get quite interesting. I mentioned that there's multiple endings in this game, and Juice's ending is definitely the most fleshed out of the four. The other three belong to Reiko, Shan, and Michio, three female machines who work in a nearby milky fuel station. Why do these random girls get endings too, though? Well, in my opinion, Juice, Reiko, Shan, and Michio are all facets of Lu's personality. They are all alter egos of hers, and so getting each ending further fleshes out Lu's story and helps to contextualize her very intricate relationship with Yang. All 4 endings operate similarly. You choose one as your companion and spend the final chapter nurturing a relationship with them. Each girl has a vastly different personality. Michio is quiet and lacks confidence. Reiko is rebellious and hot-headed, whereas Shan has a more mature, calm demeanour. Each of them represents a different part of Lu's life, from a timid child to a reckless teenager to a composed adult. Juice, then, is the most recent representation of Lu, of her time with Yang, a relationship that ultimately led to her death. Piecing together the stories that all of these characters tell, their relationship was one founded on both of them being misfits in society. Lu came from a troubled, potentially abusive household, and unfortunately her classmates and peers didn't treat her much better. She often uses the analogy that she was a garbage can, and says that Yang was the first person who didn't want to throw garbage into her. Kindness was such a foreign concept to her that Yang's good nature confused her. When all she knew was pain and hurt, anything else just feels out of place. Recounting her memories of Yang, Lu recalls her conflicted emotions towards him and how she wanted him to act. Hit me, don't hit me. Be angry, don't be angry. Forgive me, accept me, hug me, torment me. Please suffer, love me. When Yang realizes his kindness was causing her even more upset, he fell in line with those before him. He began to hurt her too. In her words, it was as if we were killing each other, while we were torn apart by sadness and desire. Who's to blame then? Naturally, Yang blames himself for what happened. In a diary titled Notes Written by Yang of the Outside World, he explicitly opens with the line, "I let her die, I killed her." And many people take this quite literally, that Lu was murdered by Yang. And that's a pretty understandable interpretation, but I don't see it that way personally. He's blaming himself for her death, but he wasn't the direct cause of it. He regrets that he didn't do more to save her, even if he's not sure how he could have saved her. And so looking back at their relationship, he's holding himself accountable in retrospect, almost like a kind of survivor's guilt. He writes, "I wanted her to live. I wished she would come out of the cage and discover the world outside, but my thoughts mean nothing because she's no longer here." I don't think there's anyone to blame. It's not that black and white. I think what happened between Yang and Lu is a tragedy, one that only Yang survived, and our experience of Garage is him learning to live with that fact. Despite everything, she tells us not to regret what happened. In her words, there is no failure between you and me. There is no doing well either. Everything just happened as it happened. So don't regret it. Don't think about what ifs. Don't pretend the whole thing never happened. When you finally leave Garage and return to the real world, the final shot of the grassy field, the same field where Yang and Lu spent so much time together, is a somber one. Yes, instead of the cluttered and claustrophobic environments of Garage, it's an open, endless space stretching for miles, and that is a refreshing change. But the clouds are grey, the trees have no leaves, and the grass looks like it's withering. It is, by all accounts, still a very bleak and dreary scene. But we hear a beautiful song simply called Lu play, which trades the rest of the soundtrack's more harsh mechanical instrumentation for a softer, more hopeful sound. Just because Yang has finally come to terms with his past doesn't mean he is healed. It would be nice if it was that simple, but this is only the beginning of that journey for him. But it is a start, and cloudy days don't have to last forever. Because Garage is a reflection of his own thoughts and perceptions of the world though, it shows the good, the bad, and the ugly of Yang's own mind. It's hard not to notice, for example, how the female machines in Garage are all seen as secondary. While the male machines own businesses, go fishing in their spare time, and all communicate to each other as equals, the female machines really only serve one purpose: producing milky fuel. Even worse, their value in Garage's society seems entirely dependent on this. Many of the townsfolk fuss over Juice because she is a major producer of fuel, whereas Chio, who produces none, is looked down upon by others and is even attacked by the other machines in one of the endings. Because she doesn't serve the one role expected of female machines, she is seen as worthless. And that is eerily similar to how some men see women in the real world too, just saying. The Milky Fuel stations are a business, after all, and each of the ones around town have female machines on hand that exist only to serve that business. If the women can't make them money, then what good are they? Such is the status quo in the world of Garage. In other words, it's a pretty brutal capitalist and patriarchal world we've got going on in here. And even if you're not much one for politics, it's hard not to notice the very purposeful narrative choices here. Even more, what does this say about Yang's view of women in general? As much as Garage is a machine serving to help him address his trauma, it also revealed some very ugly truths about himself. So, with all of that being said, what's the story with the shadows and core memories? As with most things in Garage, it's not ever fully explained, and you are left to come to your own conclusions. Personally, the process of finding your shadow is representative of that hard but very necessary first step of accepting your traumatic past. You know when people say things like, you can't help someone who won't help themselves? Finding his shadow is the first step to Yang helping himself, to begin unpacking his grief, something he should have done a long time ago. This would explain the shadow's weak and frail state when you first find it. It's been neglected, much like Yang has neglected his own emotions for a long time. Shadows in general seem to be a bit of a taboo topic within the world of Garage. Not many of the other characters will talk openly about it, bar a few exceptions like Guattari. Psyche, who is a shadow, resides in the lighthouse, but it's not really clear if she's there of her own free choice, or if the machines have trapped her there. It's no surprise that their existence is taboo though, really. The act of finding your shadow means coming face to face with some pretty harsh realities about your past. For some people, it's easier to just ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. For those that choose to find their shadow though, core memories are a further stepping stone in this healing process. In Yang's case, sneakers. But let's answer the million-dollar question here. Why sneakers of all things? We learn in Michio's ending that one day as children, Yang was protecting Lu from neighborhood bullies and they pushed him into a river. He almost died from this incident, but was thankfully saved before it was too late. He did, however, lose his shoes in the fast currents of the river. Not only was this entire incident naturally very traumatic, but it also marked the beginning of Yang and Lu's very troubled relationship. And so his sneakers are a symbol of that fateful day. It's no wonder that it became his core memory. To come to terms with Lu's death, he has to go right back to the beginning, the day that he lost his sneakers in the river. This incident isn't purely fiction either, and actually happened to Tomomi Sakuba, the creator of Garage when he was a child. In an article written by the user Morolian, which partially documents Sakuba's now defunct personal website, they wrote, when he was just 4 or 5 years old, in 1964, he drowned in a dirty sewer behind a factory. He was saved by the mail carrier, called in panic by his brother, who fished him out before the worst could happen, the taste of mouldy leaves still in his mouth. Almost 20 years later, in 1983, he was involved in a car accident where he lost 3 teeth and suffered memory loss. He was worried for a time that he would be unable to remember his own name. It's impossible not to draw a parallel with the hero of Garage, saved from the mire and deprived of his memories. The fact that everyone in Garage seems to have shadows and core memories of their own makes you wonder, are they really just constructs of your imagination, or are they actually other people, also using Garage to explore their psyche? While arguments could be made for and against these ideas, personally, my own interpretation falls somewhere in the middle. The vast majority of the machines in Garage are projections of Yang's own mind, possibly drawing inspiration from family, childhood friends, bullies, or other people he met throughout his life. But some of the characters wear their real-world inspirations on their sleeve. The strongest examples of this are in Juice's ending. As you get closer and closer to the climax of the story, it feels like the world of Garage starts to crumble around you. It's almost like Garage has finally served its purpose and it's beginning to collapse. And suddenly, Hajime, your next door neighbour and one of the kinder machines in this world, suddenly starts to speak to you like you're his grandson, calling you Sonny and telling you to go play with the other machines. Maybe Yang had a strong, supportive relationship with his grandfather in the real world, and so naturally, when he entered Garage, he wanted that kind, loving figure nearby, like a guardian angel of sorts. This would explain why Hajime lives right next door to your home and is literally the first person you speak to at the beginning of the game. He's an emotional rock that Yang leaned on in the real world and now in this world too. This is further supported by a tweet made by Sakuba, who stated that Hajime was directly inspired by his own grandfather. But interestingly, there are 2 characters that I strongly believe are not creations of Yang's mind. Those machines are Ain and Guattari. You visit Guattari in a small cabin where he lives with his female companion Yoko quite frequently, and he quickly becomes a pretty major character, often acting as a guiding figure to you in the final stretch of the game. Ain, on the other hand, works in a laboratory near the lighthouse and keeps to himself for the most part. However, this changes should you go for Juice's ending, where Ain will start making offhand comments that he exists in this world purely to, quote-unquote, witness the result, and that this world can only be saved by ending it, showing a kind of self-awareness that none of the other characters have until now. He admits to being fascinated with you. saying at one point, "I am always thinking about you, about what you choose, about where you go." His words made me wonder, what if Ain is actually a therapist from the real world keeping an eye on Yang's actions within Garage? It is a very experimental and unconventional therapy method, of course. The patient is practically trapped in a lucid dream, so it's only natural that someone from the outside world would need to keep an eye on operations. This goes for Guattari as well, but the two of them are like night and day. Whereas Ain stays out of your affairs, Guattari speaks very openly to you about shadows, how and why they exist, as well as giving you vital tools towards finding your own shadow. While this is a major help to you, the player, Ain seems to strongly disapprove of Guattari's actions in an optional letter you can find in the lighthouse. In it, Ain addresses their differing approaches to the so-called experiment, emphasizing that you and I are detached observers of this world. He condemns Guattari's decision to live in such an isolated cabin away from the town, saying, "This world is transient, and yet you tried to walk with this world. You tried to anchor yourself to this world. You have become this way because you had Yoko." Finishing the letter with, "I will never know what you will gain or what you won't be able to gain in this world, but I hope what you wished for will happen to you in a most befitting way," which is probably the most backhanded compliment I have ever heard in my life. It seems like Guattari and Ain, both perhaps therapists or scientists in the real world, entered Garage as overseers for Yang's journey. But while Ain has stayed focused on their job, Guattari has become captivated by the world and its comforts. Perhaps he enjoys the simplicity of life within Garage, so much so that he has abandoned his role as Yang's overseer and now lives as just another resident of the town. This has led to Ain and Guattari quietly feuding over the legitimacy of Garage and their role within it, and maybe even over the ethics of such a machine to begin with. It's frightening to think that the simulation Garage creates can be so realistic, so believable that someone would willingly abandon their real life in favour of it. Something that you can do yourself if you decide to just spend your days endlessly fishing. Much like Guattari, you can choose to live within this dream forever too. Dreamy is the perfect way to describe Garage. I mean, clearly, since the game's full title is Garage Bad Dream Adventure, but if it wasn't obvious by now, everything that happens in the game feels very surreal. You know when you go to bed and you have the weirdest dream, one that is strangely comedic while at the same time feels so real and so serious? The kind of dream that you just have to tell someone about after you wake up, because you can't make heads or tails of it. That entire vibe is encapsulated so well in Garage. There's the fact that you are seriously searching for a pair of sneakers for the majority of the game for one, but let me give you another example. The final objective requires you to capture a rare mythical fish called the Wang Shui 3 times, with it growing increasingly more bitter every time you do so. You are constantly plucking it out of the water after all, before it candidly asks you if you want to move on to the last chapter so you can see the game's ending. It's an unexpected moment of comedic relief in an otherwise solemn world, and this dichotomy of humour and seriousness is captured really well in Garage, just like a real dream. And sure, the absurd dreamlike events of the game can be endlessly analysed on a deeper, more metaphorical level, but there's also some things like Wang Shui that are just weird for the sake of being weird, and I love that. Despite how thought-provoking and moving Garage is, it never loses its offbeat, outlandish charm. This is especially true in its dialogue too. Now, I'll be honest, some of the translations are a little stiff. Characters have a tendency to ramble quite a bit, some sentences are way too long, and they just love to use a good ellipsis in there. Get used to seeing those 3 dots because holy shit, there is no shortage of them here. But the thing is, I can imagine that translating Garage was no easy feat to begin with. It's equally as wordy and dense in Japanese as it is in English, and I think the translators did a pretty good job at maintaining the abstract style of the characters and what they say. The frankly confusing dialogue often works in the game's favour. Garage would just not have that same dreamlike atmosphere if it was written clearly and concisely. That would kinda go against what dreams tend to be, wouldn't it? And if it wasn't obvious by now, they love to indulge in the occasional philosophical ramble, a subject that Sakuba must have a strong personal interest in. There's the constant mention of ego and self, for one, but any of you philosophers watching this might have already clocked the name Guattari. The name is a direct reference to the French philosopher and psychoanalyst Félix Guattari. And the thing that's so rad about all of this is I feel someone else could play Garage and interpret it as something completely different to me. Everything I've said here isn't objective, of course, it's just my personal speculation on the story and characters and world. I feel like everyone's experience of Garage will be different depending on how you personally interpret the world, and just something so sick about that to me. It's just like masterful storytelling, in my opinion. You can see deeper metaphors and symbolism in everything, or alternatively, you could just think it's about a bunch of weird looking little fellas and that's it. Or maybe your opinion falls somewhere in the middle of those two things. All are completely valid ways of interpreting Garage. Everyone's experience of it will be unique, and I would love to see more people make videos on Garage because of that, just to see how differently they experienced it from me. There's also so many other characters, subplots, and areas that I didn't really touch upon here because, well, this video was already getting long enough as is, and I just made a 3-hour video. I don't think I could put myself through that twice in a row. But Medici, probably one of the scummier machines in town, there's a lot to unpack with that guy, or the entire New World area and its pretty messed up history that you can learn about. It's insane how densely packed with lore and world building Garage is. Such a fully realised vision, and I could talk about it for hours, honestly. Garage quickly jumped up the ranks as one of my favourite games ever after I finished it. This is not something that happens often for me. My top favourite video games have basically been an ironclad list that hasn't changed since I was about 10 years old, but Garage just left such a massive impact on me. The way its story hits you like a truck by the time the credits roll, the haunting soundtrack, the art style that was as creepy as it was enchanting, I couldn't stop thinking about it all. It's wild then to think that this game was completely inaccessible to most people for literally decades. In fact, it was considered lost media for over 20 years due to complications during development and distribution, with only its small but dedicated fandom keeping it alive during those 2 decades. It bums me out to think that I might have never been able to play this gem had things worked out differently. So let's recount that history, to really put into perspective how lucky we are to be able to play Garage today. To be able to do this story justice, we need to start from the very beginning, with Tomomi Sakuba himself. Born in 1959, Sakuba had a passion for art and design since he was very young, and was particularly drawn to manga and anime with machinery and robots. On his personal website, he recalls practicing drawing Tetsujin 28 from the 1950s manga of the same name. Even as a child, he was particularly drawn to horror, or at least horror-adjacent media. Think things like the original Devilman or Gegege no Kitaro. He enjoyed stories that played on the idea of characters that had demonic features, or characters that were half human, half creature. And his biggest inspiration was the manga Ode to Kirihito by Osamu Tezuka, which tells the story of a doctor who travels to a village where a strange disease turns its victims into half human, half dog people. In his 20s, he rekindled his interest in machinery, particularly locomotives and basically anything mechanical, the influence of which is very obvious in his artwork even to this day. Alongside exhibiting his work in art galleries, Sakuba had 2 major projects in the 80s. First, he illustrated a 1987 re-release of Alice in Wonderland, which turned quite a few heads at the time, giving the familiar classic tale a more unsettling visual direction. Looking at artwork from it, you can see Sakuba's fascination with drawing extremely intricate set pieces. Even just the key art for each chapter has an almost mechanical structure to it. It adds such a fresh new flavour to a story that we've seen dozens of times already. So much so that original copies of this Alice in Wonderland reissue go for well over €100 a piece, largely in part due to Sakuba's artwork. His next project was even more ambitious. In 1988, Sakuba released his first ever original story, for which, of course, he also did the illustrations. It was called Tengoku no Jidou Kaidan, or Escalator to Heaven. It followed a man travelling through a mysterious and bizarre world on his motorbike trying to get to heaven. Interestingly, the main character is called Ulibu, a name that Sakuba later used again for a minor character in Garage. One user, Kisaragi, on booklog.jp described the novel as absurd yet logical, silly yet profoundly deep. A perfect one-sentence descriptor for Garage as well, in my opinion. Much like Alice in Wonderland, original copies of Escalator to Heaven go for a pretty penny online, not to mention the difficulty of finding a copy that's still in good condition 40 years later. This was around the same time that home video games were starting to rise in popularity. At this point, it's the early 90s and Sakuba was newly married and had a young son, and he bought Dragon Quest II on the NES for them to play together. Sakuba quickly became fascinated with video games as an artistic medium, and he knew that he would love to be involved in the creation of a video game one day. A few years later, in 1996, a mutual friend introduced him to two members of the small development team Kinotrope, who were just about to release the very unique FMV adventure game Bi Senjo no Alice. Sakuba and Kinotrope were a match made in heaven, both having an affinity for the more weird and experimental approach to their game design, be it artistically or mechanically. Development of Garage formally began in 1997, with Sakuba as the director, writer, and art designer. Tomonori Tanaka composed the music, and the remaining 5 members were made up of 2 producers, 2 graphic designers, and 1 singular programmer, making up the very modest 7-person team working on Garage. It finally released in March 1999 on Windows and Macintosh, and was published by Toshiba EMI, retailing at 4,800 yen. The original release came in a classic PC big box, containing the game disc, manual, and a map of the town. If you've noticed that the footage I'm showing you right now is a bit more rough around the edges than before, that's because I'm showing you the original 1999 version of the game, the vanilla untranslated release. The interface, as I'm sure you've noticed, is a lot more minimalistic. The movement is less fluid, and interestingly, there's only 1 ending in this version, as opposed to the 4 endings in the modern re-release. It's important to note as well that the widely popular point-and-click genre of the 90s was a very Western-dominated one. There were some point-and-clicks made in Japan, sure, but overall, visual novels were much more popular over there at the time, so Garage was really quite unusual in this respect. At the time of its release, Japanese media outlets often compared Garage to 2 other offbeat titles, the 1997 FMV adventure game Kowloon's Gate, and the 1998 roguelike RPG Baroque. The trio of games earned the title Sandai Kige, or in English, the Big 3 Bizarre Games, all 3 of which I have been quite eager to cover myself on this channel. But unfortunately, there was a major roadblock shortly after release. Toshiba EMI withdrew from the CD-ROM business, and the already very limited production of Garage was discontinued because of this. Only 3,000 copies were ever produced during its initial run, so Garage practically became gold dust the second it released. It never released outside of Japan either, further adding to its rarity. As the years went by, the price for an authentic copy just went up and up, very quickly reaching a price tag in the hundreds. Between its eccentric visual design and its physical rarity, Garage quickly grew a cult following both in its native Japan and overseas, a cult following that transcended even language barriers. A lot of non-Japanese fans had no real clue what the game was even about, but they just knew that something that looked this visually bizarre had to have an equally outlandish plot. And 2.5 decades later, I can safely say they were right in thinking that. In 2004, with permission from Kinotrope, Sakuba organised a very brief reprint of Garage, this time called Garage Private Edition, which was a collector's edition, effectively, featuring different packaging and the inclusion of concept art this time around. And if you thought 3,000 copies was bad, you're gonna lose it at this one. Since the private edition was purely a solo effort by Sakuba, only 90 copies of it were ever produced, and they quickly sold out in just 1 day on April 20th, 2004. Sakuba did another brief run of regular editions on his website in September 2007, and surprise surprise, they were all whipped up very quickly. Between the original 1999 release, the private edition, and the very brief 2007 rerun, only about 3,500 physical copies of Garage exist, and it continued to remain as elusive lost media for years. The only way people could experience it in any capacity was watching low-quality footage uploaded by Japanese players on websites like Nico Nico Doga. Japan has very harsh anti-piracy laws after all, so the few people who even owned the game to begin with just weren't willing to risk any legal issues if they were to rip and upload the game online. That is until early 2014, when users of the Hardcore Gaming 101 message boards managed to snag a legitimate original 1999 copy of Garage on Yahoo Auctions Japan for the comparatively good price of 77,000 yen, or roughly €500. This was then ripped and uploaded online, making Garage finally accessible for people to play 15 years after its initial release. Scans and photos of the manual, game disc, map and packaging were uploaded as well. And while this was a major win for fans, no doubt, there was still unfortunately a massive problem: the language barrier. Garage is a very dialogue-heavy game, and even worse, the dialogue can get pretty complex and philosophical, so much so that even a native Japanese speaker would struggle to follow it. It's not really a game you can fumble through to the end either, and even if you did, you're missing some really strong world building and character writing. So while the game was finally available to play, yes, unless you could speak Japanese, you still weren't going to understand a word of it. There were rumblings of an English translation in the works across multiple websites in the years after 2014, but because it was such a massive undertaking, it was a long wait before people would be able to play Garage in English. This long wait ended in late 2020, when an English patch finally surfaced, and they really did a fantastic job translating some seriously challenging source material. After 21 years, over 2 decades, Garage was not only playable, but fully translated into English. But its story doesn't end there. Sakuba, the creator, noticed the growing interest in Garage as the years went by. It started to get more coverage in gaming articles and YouTube videos after all, and despite it being a small-scale production that only released in Japan in the 90s, he was surprised that it had grown an international cult following. It annoyed him all the more then that physical copies of the game were selling for such outrageous prices, and this was something he wanted to address. He admitted though that he was unwilling to release the original game as it was, because there was a lot of things about it he wanted to improve. Writing on his personal website, he said, "It is true that there was a considerable amount of Garage that I felt I had left undone or was unable to complete. I previously wrote on Twitter that after releasing Garage, I struggled for 2 or 3 years to escape from that world. And more than half of the reason for this was that the things I had left undone kept coming back to haunt me." More than a remaster, he wanted to remake Garage. If a modern port were to happen at all, Sakuba wanted to make sure it would be the game in his truest vision, the game he wishes he could have released all those years ago. Enter Smoky Monkey S, a 2-man Japanese indie development team that Sakuba had been friends with since the early 2000s. They approached him with the idea of remaking Garage, despite initially lacking the funding and even the game's source code, which had long been lost to time. But unlike the original release, they don't have a big publisher breathing down their neck and forcing strict deadlines this time, and this was what convinced Sakuba to take the leap. He said, "As you can imagine, this was nothing less than a reckless endeavour. But the original Garage was also the result of a reckless endeavour." Sakuba opened a Campfire page for Garage Complete Edition in late 2020, Campfire being the Japanese equivalent of Kickstarter, by the way, hoping that the generosity of obscure game fans and lost media enthusiasts alike would help secure funding and make this remake a reality. The goal was 3 million yen, roughly €20,000, a fairly humble ask considering their ambitions with the project. This goal was met in just 3 hours, and funding continued for a few weeks after that. In the end, over 2,000 people supported the game, and together they raised 7 times the initial funding goal, with the final amount raised being just under an insane 23 million yen, equivalent to €130,000. If that doesn't show the interest that exists for games like Garage, then I don't know what does. The 2 members of Smoky Monkey S had to go about development in a rather unusual way. Since the original source code was lost, they only knew how Garage worked from the outside. There was no way for them to dig into the game's files, so instead they replayed Garage over and over again and remade the game from scratch. On a blog post on their website commemorating Garage's 25th anniversary, they described it as akin to copying by ear like a musician would, immersing themselves in the source material over and over again so that they could replicate it as authentically as possible. Garage Complete Edition released on iOS and Android in December 2021, later seeing a Steam and Switch release in the years after that. There was also a brief run of Garage merchandise as well. Hoodies, mugs, keychains, LED stands, the whole works. I am praying that they do another merch drop at some point because some of these honestly look really sick. Believe it or not, Garage actually wasn't Sakuba's only venture into the world of game development. There were at least 2 more projects he worked on after Garage, neither of which ever made it to release, unfortunately. There was Regula, which Sakuba was co-creating alongside Nakaji Kimura, the director of Kowloon's Gate, but plans fell through midway and there is precious little information of it online. The other project was an online game called The World's End, which was going to follow a traveller and his biomechanical slave as they tried to reach the end of the world. It would have a human realm and a spiritual realm, and gameplay would revolve around hunting, gathering, and protecting yourself from monsters. Even though The World's End never came to be, you can still very much see Sakuba's artistic flair in its visual design, between the rundown houses, the mechanical creatures, and its somber, moody atmosphere. As for Kinotrope, they ditched making games back in the 90s and focused their efforts on web development, still in operation today. Sakuba still has very close ties with the company though. In 2017, they collaborated on a phone app called Henga, so I downloaded it to check it out myself. You can use these neat monster filters and designs that all look like they jumped straight out of Garage and take pictures with it, and that's basically all you can do, but it's fun to mess around in, it's cool, and totally free, so hell yeah, you should check it out. Sakuba hasn't left the gaming scene entirely though. He collaborated with Smoky Monkey S once again for 9 Lives, a project that has sadly been on hold for a few years now, but as of 2024 it's still available to play for free, even in its unfinished state. I definitely recommend doing so just to run around and check out its lonely but beautiful world. I really hope this project gets revived one day. Garage is one of the rare examples of a game that became lost media only to be saved from that obscurity. Lost media is a muddled term, but I believe the best and most succinct definition is any form of information, entertainment, or other media that was once available to the public which is now irrecoverable or otherwise unable to be consumed. In the world of video games, a modern example of this would be PT, the 2014 playable teaser for Silent Hills. The teaser was only ever released digitally on the PS4, and when Silent Hills sadly got cancelled, the teaser was removed from the digital storefront. Some lucky people might still own it on their consoles, yes, but even our consoles will eventually die one day. And anyone who doesn't own it, well, you don't get to, because it's not available anymore, at least legally, and probably never will be ever again. One of Sakuba's artistic contemporaries in the 90s, Osamu Sato, released an experimental PC game called Chu Teng that went through a similar experience to Garage. If Sato's name doesn't ring any bells, you might be more familiar with his other work, LSD Dream Emulator, a pretty popular go-to example of weird experimental video games. Chu Teng only released in Japan and became lost media for a decade or two before eventually a copy of it was unearthed and preserved by fans in 2014. Games becoming lost media like this is unfortunately a very common occurrence, especially if they were small scale or lower budget releases. It's frighteningly common in the AAA scene too. Something I always think about is the PlayStation Store on the PS3. I grew up playing this console and I remember digging through the seemingly infinite amount of games on there. A digital storefront like this allowed smaller releases to have their time to shine. Games that were neither indie nor massively high budget. Now some of them might have had physical releases or have since been ported to newer platforms, but a lot of them haven't. They're stuck on the PS3. And what happens when those digital storefronts inevitably close down? At the time of making this video, the PS3 store is still alive and kicking, but I can't imagine it will be for much longer. Some of these games will become lost media, guaranteed. Big companies like Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, they could all do something about this. They could make way more effort to future-proof their game libraries, make them accessible in a way that we won't have to worry about them ever being lost to time, but they just don't. They don't care, I guess. Game preservation isn't where you make the big bucks these days, so it's probably not financially lucrative enough to care, and there's something really sad about that. It's sad to think there's games that a group of developers worked tirelessly to create that will just disappear one day. The fact that for both the developer and player alike, that game will just become a memory. Video games are a form of art, just like film, literature, music, and I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here with this one, but I just wish major companies cared half as much about safeguarding them as fans do. Because when you preserve a game, or a film, or anything really, you're not just preserving the piece of entertainment that it is, but also the culture from which it came. Garage, for example, is one of many games that was born from a wave of artists using video games as an exciting new medium for their art. And so you're preserving that history as much as you're preserving the game itself. And I think that's part of why I'm making this video at all. We already came so dangerously close to losing Garage once, and now that it's so easily accessible, I want to do my small part too in making sure it's never forgotten. Garage could have easily slipped into obscurity forever had its small but dedicated fandom not kept its memory alive, even when a lot of that fandom couldn't understand the language or even play the game to begin with. It's that enthusiasm that set the wheels in motion for its re-release to happen over 2 decades later. And maybe there's a few more cool, obscure games that could have their own renaissance just like Garage did. So make that fan art, make those video essays and let's plays and whatever else have you. Keep the memory of older, obscure games alive. Because whether it was made by a team of dozens of people or was a one-man solo effort, whether it's a masterpiece or an absolute disaster, someone spent months or years to create that. Someone poured their artistic soul into that game. And there's few things more tragic to me, I think, than art being forgotten.